Vistam 151, go around.
Go around, Vistam 151.
Vistam 151, heavy, thanks. The last departure lost the wheel on departure, so we're going to have to shut the runway down. So fly runway heading and maintain 3000.
Roger, Vistam 151.
Omnicon 7 heavy, we're going to have to...
Welcome to Brasher Warning, the podcast that dives deep into aviation incidents with sharp analysis, insightful discussions, and just a touch of edge. If you're passionate about aviation and love a good post-incident breakdown, you're in the right place. Before we take off, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share with your crew.
Tonight, we're diving into a tragic crash, a Piper PA-24260 that went down in Scottsdale, Arizona back in 2018.
6 lives lost, a real tragedy.
Exactly, and we're going to be looking at the NTSB's final report, trying to understand what happened and what lessons we can take away, for all of us.
It's a somber reminder, really, about how important weight and balance are in aviation, along with, of course, mechanical integrity and just the human decisions that are made.
We'll be looking at a couple of different sources. We've got an accident analysis and then the final NTSB aviation investigation report.
Sounds good.
And between these two reports, it gives a really clear picture of all the contributing factors that, unfortunately, led to this accident.
And more importantly, how to improve.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So to set the scene a little bit, this flight was supposed to be a quick one, just a nighttime hop from Scottsdale over to North Las Vegas. And he was operating under visual meteorological conditions, VMC, which basically means, clear weather for anyone who's not familiar with the term. And it was a Part 91 general aviation flight, so a private flight, not commercial or anything like that. But tragically, the flight lasted only 70 seconds. The investigators were able to use surveillance footage, air traffic control recordings, eyewitness accounts, put it all together to make a detailed timeline. They even had data showing the plane's wings rocking during takeoff, observed by the tower. So one of the biggest things they found was the aircraft's weight. This plane was overloaded, 135 pounds over its maximum limit. It's like adding another passenger to an already full car. And that much extra weight, it dramatically changes the aircraft's center of gravity.
Right, the balance point.
Yeah.
It's like, if you're trying to balance on a seesaw with too much weight on one side.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In this case, the plane's center of gravity was too far aft, or too far back, which made it super hard to control, especially during takeoff. And then, to make matters worse, there was a hidden mechanical issue going on. One of the cylinders had a fractured valve spring, probably due to metal fatigue over time. Now, this would reduce the engine power, something that might not have been noticeable during normal flight.
Sure.
But under this strain, the overload and that challenging balance, it became critical.
Wow, so you've got this deadly combination, overloaded plane, balance point too far back, and then reduced engine power.
Right, and according to the NTSB, this all combined made it basically impossible for the pilots to maintain control of the aircraft during the climb.
So much going wrong all at once.
Yeah, it's a lot to contend with.
Yeah, it's a really stark reminder that all those seemingly small things can just, cascade into a major problem when they all happen at the same time.
Absolutely, and this is a lesson not just for pilots, but anyone working in fields where safety is critical.
Totally agree with that.
Now let's talk about the pilots involved in this accident. The pilot in command, he was very experienced, an airline transport pilot, over 5,200 flight hours under his belt. But he'd only logged 2 hours of flight time in this specific model of aircraft.
Oh, that's an important detail.
Yeah, and it just shows you experience in general is great, but knowing the specific aircraft you're flying is crucial. Now, to add another layer of complexity here, the student pilot who was also on board, he was actually in the left seat.
Which is usually the pilot in command position.
Yeah, typically. So it raises questions about how decisions were made in the cockpit. Did the seating arrangement play a role? Maybe, combined with the difference in experience levels, did it contribute to a lapse in judgment? And there's one thing the pilot said to air traffic control right before the crash that really stands out. He said, "We're good. We're just in training mode." It's kind of chilling when you think about it.
Yeah, were they trying to, downplay a situation that was maybe getting out of hand? Or was it just a casual approach to a really critical phase of flight? It's hard to know for sure.
Yeah, it's really hard to say, but it's a detail that definitely makes you think. Now, the NTSB report, it goes into incredible depth, analyzing all these factors. It's amazing how they used everything from the wreckage to the pilots' backgrounds to figure out what happened.
The wreckage analysis itself, I mean, that must have been a huge undertaking, right? Like putting all those pieces back together.
Oh, yeah. They examined the debris field, which was spread out over a golf course near the runway, studied the engine components looking for any little clue.
Right.
And they found evidence of that fractured valve spring we talked about.
Okay.
Even signs that the propeller had separated from the engine because of the stress from the overload. And the report doesn't just stop at explaining what happened. It also gives some very concrete recommendations for how to prevent similar accidents.
Which is really the most important part, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Like, what can we learn from this?
So one key area they focused on was engine maintenance. They're recommending more frequent and thorough inspections, maybe even using new technologies to detect those microscopic cracks that can form. Catching those small issues early could make all the difference. The report also stresses the importance of pilot training, suggesting they incorporate more realistic simulations that really challenge pilots' decision-making under pressure.
So it's not just about knowing how to fly the plane. It's about being mentally prepared for those high-stress situations.
Exactly. And it's about creating a culture where pilots feel comfortable speaking up if something doesn't feel right.
Right, like no fear of judgment, just focusing on safety as the top priority. Because as tragic as this accident was, if we can learn the right lessons, it has the potential to save lives in the future.
That's a really good point. So let's talk about those lessons. What are the key takeaways for all pilots out there, whether they're flying small planes or big commercial jets?
Well, first and foremost, never compromise on safety, Pilots need to really understand and respect those weight and balance limits.
Yeah, and know the aircraft they're flying inside and out.
Exactly. Even if you have thousands of hours of experience, each plane's different.
It's about being meticulous, double-checking everything.
Right. And if something feels off, don't hesitate to abort the takeoff. Better to be safe on the ground than risk it in the air.
Absolutely. Another thing the report highlighted was the importance of clear communication.
Oh, that's huge, especially in aviation. Every word matters.
Yeah, pilots need to be able to communicate clearly and quickly, especially when things go wrong.
Right, there's no room for misinterpretation.
Now, this accident also brings up the concept of the flight envelope, which I think is important for everyone to understand, not just pilots.
Okay, what's that?
So the flight envelope basically defines the safe operating limits of an aircraft. Things like airspeed, altitude, and of course weight and balance.
Right, so going outside those limits, that's when you can run into trouble.
Exactly. It's like a set of boundaries that pilots need to stay within to make sure they're flying safely.
And this accident shows what can happen when those boundaries are pushed too far.
We had the overloaded condition, the aft center of gravity, the reduced engine power, all those factors combined push the aircraft outside those limits.
And it just goes to show, how important it is to stay within those boundaries.
Yeah, it's a good point. And that doesn't even just apply to aviation, right? Like pushing those boundaries without knowing the consequences can be dangerous in a lot of situations. Before we wrap up, I want to touch on one more detail from the NTSB report. It mentions a toxicology report conducted on the student pilot.
Yeah, and the report showed traces of cocaine and MDMA, suggesting he'd used them at some point.
Right, but the NTSB concluded that the levels were way too low to have had any effect on his abilities during the flight.
Yeah, the timing of when he'd used those drugs was unclear, but they likely wouldn't have had any significant impact by the time of the accident.
It's important to clarify that because while drug use is definitely a serious concern in aviation, it wasn't a factor in this particular crash.
Exactly. The focus really needs to stay on that combination of the overload, the aft center of gravity, and the reduced engine power.
What would you say is the most important message for our listeners?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that safety is everyone's responsibility.
Not just the pilots, but everyone.
Yeah, it's the maintenance crews, air traffic controllers, even the passengers. We all have a role to play in making aviation safer.
And that idea of shared responsibility, it goes beyond just aviation, right? It's about bringing that same awareness, diligence, and commitment to learning to everything we do in life.
Exactly. I mean, if we can learn from tragedies like this and make changes, even small ones in our own practices, it'll be a step towards preventing future accidents.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to think about what you've learned today. What steps can you take in your own lives to put safety first and minimize risks? Keep that in mind, and until next time, stay curious and keep exploring with us here on The Deep Dive.
Thanks for tuning in to Brasher Warning. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe so you never miss a flight with us. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment or review, and don't forget to share the podcast with your fellow aviation enthusiasts. Until next time, stay sharp, stay safe, and keep soaring.
American 1552, contact center 127.0.
1552, we're going to be mayday, mayday, mayday. We have an engine failure. We're going to return to DFW.
1552, roger. And which runway do you need?
We'll take 18 right.
Roger, make 1552, turn right heading 020, just going to maintain 8,000.